I never knew what it was like to be loved by a family, at least not for the first 50 years of my existence. Born Daniel Edwards in November of 1870, I was a freak child the moment I first opened my pure white eyes. There were no pupils, only clear white. I was never old enough to remember where it was I actually lived before the accident, only that it was in the eastern region of the United States. My mother was a very loving, outspoken woman who was cursed to sharing me with my demonic father. He was a hateful, brutal excuse for a man with a nasty habit for emptying as many bottles in a day as he possibly could. His name was Chester Edwards, once a respected man of his community, until one day he just changed. I wasn't sure what had happened to him. Neither he or my mother ever spoke a word about it. All I knew about him were the whisperings as my mother and I would visit the grocery store or church. "That's his son," they would whisper, both the young and the old alike. "The freak with no pupils. Gross, can he even see us? I don't know, but his dad's a freak too. He used to chase criminals, did a lot of good for our small town in times of war. Guys like him in spirit are what kept us alive." Yeah, right, and now he's an abusive husband and father who hasn't been sober since the war. Chester Wolfman Edwards is a miserable sack of... My mother would always cover my ears before I could hear anything more, rushing to wherever the nearest exit was. What they didn't know was that I could see more than just them. I could see others as well. People who were dead, in dull, gray forms. Moaning and groaning, they would just drift along every so often, inconsistently. If they knew I could see them, they obviously didn't care, because they have never approached or spoken to me. I was only 3 years old when I tried to tell my mother, who insisted such things weren't real, and urged me to never speak of it again. My father, on the other hand, had overheard and was not happy. That was the first time he'd ever put hands on me, leaving lashes on my back and welts on my head. Eventually, I forced myself to believe that they were made up, just my imagination playing tricks on my young and impressionable mind. I'd focus my attention elsewhere every time one of those ghouls so much as hovered near me, pleading for them to vanish. After a couple of months, I decided that they would fade away as I got older, that it was futile to fight off my childish visions. But nothing would ever work. Not in this century, anyway. It was when the nice old man from down the road died that I realized the ghosts were very, very real. Just after the old-timer's funeral, I could see him plain as day, in a spiritual form, babbling as he hovered around the assembled party of friends and family, none of them even slightly aware that he was among us. I was only 4 years old then, just a year away from the trauma that awaited me. My 5th birthday had come and passed just 3 weeks before Chester Edwards crumbled under his own madness. You see, my father was never happy. In fact, he was so beyond unhappy all the time that whenever we returned home, he'd have just finished his whiskey, ready to victimize both of us. This night, however, was different. Not 5 seconds in the door, and he was already upon us, screaming at my mother in such a drunken tone that I couldn't even understand most of his ramblings. As she shielded me with her body, my father subjected her to horrible, cruel names, and even a few smacks to the face. He had let his facial hair grow into a menacing, red beard these last few weeks, an obvious sign that he was losing it. "Shut your mouth," he screamed at her over and over again, until she was shaking and crying frantically. My wide eyes were wide, filled with enough fear to kill an elephant. "Not in front of Daniel, please!" I said, "Shut up," my father bellowed, punching the poor, fragile woman in the head. She collapsed to her knees, revealing me behind her, shuddering as tears slowly ran down my face. "What's the matter with you?" he shrieked, more like a demand than anything else. "Quit your crying, son!" My few tears became 2 flowing streams down my face, dripping from my chin as I cringed away from the man. This only made him angrier, so as my mother began to pull herself back up, he kicked her in the ribs, planting her right back on the floor between him and I. "Stop crying right now," he yelled at me as loud as his lungs would let him, raising his fist at me. "I'll beat the coward right out of you too. Just watch me." As my back hit the door, giving me nowhere else to run, I slumped to a seated position. As he advanced, I thought it was all over. This would be the cruel, dramatic end for the freak child with a more than dysfunctional home. "Leave him alone!" my mother shouted, reaching up to claw at my father's face. Just as her jagged nails left gashes in his expression, he howled in both hatred and sudden agony, pushing her back to the floor. "How dare you!" he barked at her, kicking until he was no longer trying to crawl away. "I'll kill you!" "Please!" she begged him, her body appearing mangled beneath his feet. "Not in front of Daniel. Leave him out of the— I'll do whatever the hell I please, woman," my father growled, grabbing a fistful of her red hair. "You'll see what I'm really capable of. There won't be any more laughing at Chester Edwards." "Please, no," she wept, kicking and pleading as he dragged her out of the entryway and into the kitchen by her hair. "No, Chester." "You won't ever give me that look of disappointment ever again. Not after tonight," he snarled, the sound of clattering telling me he was ruffling through our knife drawer. "I'll find the sharpest." The next few minutes forced me to bury my head between my legs, sobbing as the sound of my mother's desperate cries for help rang into my ears, followed by the sound of a blade entering her over and over. As the horrible noise stopped, I was shaking, rattling against the door as silence took hold in the darkest of the house. The candles had all been extinguished by the splattered blood of my now deceased mother. I felt all alone despite my father being in the next room, still stabbing his wife's corpse. It didn't matter that there were several spirits hovering in the room around me. My mother was gone, the only person who would ever truly kept me safe from the monster sharing our roof. How I longed to become one of them, ignorant to the burdens of the living, forever impervious to the physical or emotional harm. "Where are you, boy?" I suddenly heard my father yell, and I whimpered, curling up into a ball against the front door. His footsteps were like high notes being played on an instrument only death would carry, the sinister music of a murderous madman. Chester Edwards had never shown any sign of love for either his wife or his now terrified son, instead having spent his days proving he felt the opposite. It didn't matter why he had hated them so much, only that his hate had taken physical form through him, ready to butcher his family. "Daniel!" my father shrieked, scratching his bloody knife on the doorway into the dining room. As he slowly entered, I remained huddled in the entryway against the front door. I was shaking as he stopped, stunning me for a moment in the darkness, the only light being what precious moon came through the foggy windows. "What are you doing, son?" he asked me in a groggy tone, once again stepping towards me. "Tell me!" he barked, stomping his boot on the floor when I didn't answer. It wasn't that I didn't want to answer, it was that I was too horrified to say anything to anyone. All I could do was shiver and weep, praying that my fate would be decided sooner and with less pain than my mother's had been. "Stop your crying, boy," he grunted, standing right in front of me. As he towered over me, the fear in my chest became overwhelming, threatening to implode. Perhaps I would be blessed with a heart attack before he could put his crimson-colored hands on me. I could see the knife in his hands, glowing red in the moonlight like a symbol of family murder. Is that what happens to some children? We live miserable, wretched lives of loneliness and abuse until one day our parents butcher one another, leaving us to be torn apart as well. "Please, Dad," I begged him, crying harder. "Don't hurt me." "Please?" My father gave me a funny look, quickly changing into an expression of pure, untamed rage. "Please?" he exploded, grabbing me by the collar of my shirt. As I was pulled off the ground high enough so that our faces were too close for comfort, I sniffled, turning away from him. "Look at me, child!" the evil, terrible man hissed, shaking me. "I want you to look at what's going to happen to you." "No!" I yelped, kicking and tugging away from him. "Leave me alone!" "You aren't giving me orders," he growled, putting the blade of the knife to my throat. "I'll carve you out just the same if you don't keep quiet." His words were meaningless to me, given that I had already believed I was going to die, no matter how this turned out. In that moment, I fully lost it, opening my lungs to release the largest cry the world had ever heard. "Shut up," he snarled at me, pressing his weapon against my skin just lightly enough to cut. "Shut up now!" As my screams of utter terror continued, it seemed as if the ghosts and spirits around me had taken notice. My cries were like nails on a chalkboard to them, and several dozens of angry souls began to approach us, reaching out with their hands. I could also feel a deep, funny feeling of something gathering within my body, making me feel almost weightless. It only took another handful of moments for my father to turn his head, both of us realizing that he could see the spirits as well. "No," he croaked, letting me go. As I fell to the floor, his legs began to quiver, and he took a step back as the spirits came closer, new ones even coming through the walls from the outside of the house. "What the hell?" my demonic father shrieked and then turned to me once more. "You're the one doing this, aren't you, freak child?" I didn't answer him, instead letting the howling ghosts get ever closer to us. I wanted them to do whatever it was that they intended, even if it meant that I died as well. All I wanted was for the terrible man to be punished for what he'd done this night. "Screw this!" he yelled, cursing as he pushed me to the floor. "I'm not afraid of you," my father told the oncoming spirits. "Do you know who I am? I'm Chester!" His self-introduction was cut short as a ghoul grabbed his wrists from behind, pulling them out of place. The man yelped as he tried to pull away, but that only brought on more pain, bringing even more angry sobs from his wretched mouth. "No!" he snarled, looking down at me. "Make them stop!" I looked up at him with cold, teary eyes as I slowly shook my head, damning him to whatever the ghosts had in store for the both of us. I no longer cared about what happened to me, only that I could ensure my father suffered for killing my mother. "Stay back," he told the seemingly angry spirits, raising his knife at them. As he swung and stabbed the blade, it was obvious that they weren't intimidated, still coming towards us. His knife passed right through them, doing absolutely no harm to their gray, hovering forms. The first ghost was a woman, howling as she swiped the blade from my father's hand, followed with her shoving 2 fingers into his eye sockets. My father shouted as he was blinded, slowly being pulled to the floor as more ghosts got their cold, dead fingers on him. They tore and ripped at his body until he was completely buried beneath them in a dog pile. As a puddle of blood began to cover the entire floor, I cowered back against the front door, waiting for the ghosts to do their worst to me. But as the horrifying second went by, I realized that they weren't going to harm me, as they would already have if they were actually going to. Were they protecting me? I didn't want to be left alive, especially not after tonight. My mother was dead, leaving me with less than abusive, murderous demon of a father to take care of me. Was this just a cruel joke? As everything seemed to crash around me, I screamed louder as to drown out my father's continuous howls and the horrible, hungry moaning of the spirits. I continued screaming until my lungs should have burst, far beyond my physical capabilities. But nothing about this night had to make sense. Nothing had thus far. My agonizing sense of loss was stronger than my body's limits, carrying me into a painful rage that brought on more that tingling feeling from within. It grew until my body was glowing a bright white, lighting up the entire house like a lantern filled with death and misery. Before I knew it, the house was shaking violently as it began to crumble around us. I would have feared for my life if the next moment hadn't seen me vanish in the blink of an eye, never to be seen on Earth again in this lifetime.